everybody. I've got Edosa with me today, and we are going to be talking about the idea of a frictionless experience. But before I dive into the questions that I have for you, can you give everybody a quick introduction?
Of course. Hi, Emma. Thanks for having me. So I'm Edosa Odaro, and I suppose you can think of me as a data and AI transformation specialist. I have been doing this for a little while now, but it's really interesting. I mean, one of my roles in recent times is heading up the data function for AXA Insurance. But aside from that, more recently, I was actually doing some work for a very interesting startup called Theory and Practice. Plenty of history. But interestingly, when people ask me, things like, how did I even get into data and AI and technology? It's funny, I think about it and I wonder, it really was a bit of a, I think it was actually failure in some ways that led me to this, strangely, because I remember very early on, I wanted to be a pilot, would you believe? I'm not very tall. And in those days, it was kind of taboo. You couldn't be a pilot. You had to be a certain sort of height. And my dad broke it to me, and it was very depressing. So I failed in that first attempt as to what I really wanted to do. And I thought, all right, okay, I'll go into university and study biochemistry, would you believe? And thought, actually, a year in, I thought, this is not it for me. I've got to do something. And I just recaptured this moment when I was much younger, and I used to play out with some, what we used to call computers in those days. I used to play out with, I'd have these games, and I'd go in and alter the game and change the colors of the Space Invaders and things like that. I thought, I actually like that. And that's how I got into computers in the first place. So there you go. That's a little bit of a story.
I actually really love hearing those origin stories. And a lot of times we don't go into what got you interested in technology in the first place. So for somebody that came into technology from the outside world, I love hearing those stories too. So let's get started with our conversation today by just kind of setting a shared definition for everybody that's joining us about what a frictionless interaction is and really why we should be thinking about it and caring about it.
That's a good question. And I've talked a bit about this in past lives, actually. And I think the way I like to think about it is almost taking a step back and consider why we actually get together in the first place. Either as groups or as, people coming into an organization, startups, and actually, of course, big established organizations. Really, a lot of it is about coming together to reduce costs, I would say. I suppose from an economic sort of standpoint, it's really about how can I get more with less. We think about it as like economies of scale. We think about it as, okay, how do we reduce the amount of effort it will take to actually get this outcome? Right? And I think that's the underlying principle of why we're coming together to actually get this output. Is either we're in there to make things more secure, we're in there to make it easier, quicker, faster, better. But what happens over time is that the interactions or the coming together, the actual flow of information between people who have come together starts to become hampered, either by things like structures, hierarchies. Companies get bigger, organizations get bigger, and start to create groups which are meant to make this whole process more efficient, by the way. So you create specialist groups, functional areas, departments, units, teams, and all sorts. And what then happens is where at the start, you're all around a table and you have these conversations and it all flows. Suddenly what you have is the information just doesn't flow quite so well anymore. And you start to have, I suppose you can think about that as you start to have frictions, because the turnaround between someone having some information and passing it on to somebody else within a separate team or within a certain part of the organization, that distance just becomes longer, basically. The actual timing becomes longer. And it starts to create issues then for the ultimate aim of coming together, which is that you want to make things better, faster, more efficient. So in some ways, the organization starts to work against itself, if it makes any sense. And that's basically what I consider a friction situation, a situation where there's interaction or friction. So when you think about what is a frictionless, it's in effect almost going back to that place where you're sat around a table and you can actually exchange freely with almost zero distance then between you passing information and that information actually being received.
So one thing that we talk a lot about within the digital transformation space is this idea of breaking down silos, and to what you were just talking about, sharing information freely across the organization. I know I talk a lot about that and how the benefits that come to an organization if you're able to achieve that. But it's not as easy as it sounds. Can you share a little bit on your thoughts of kind of how that is more complicated than just like, oh, break down silos?
Yes, I think that's been something, when did it start? Actually, probably about 30 years now. It's been on this idea of breaking down silos as a way to solve this problem of interactional friction. I think, yes, it's easy to say, very, very difficult to do. First of all, when you're at a certain size, it's very, very difficult actually to think about it, to organize all of your resources without actually setting up units and teams and in effect creating buckets of people, or whatever you want to call them, in terms of ways of organizing people into either functional areas, into product teams, or whatever else. As soon as you do that, as soon as you create a shell of sorts, whether that's virtual or it's people in rooms or locations, it basically creates silos by default. It's not an intentional activity. Just in terms of having that definition of I'm a team and I have this idea of what makes my team successful. As soon as that's different from team A, team B, team C, you suddenly create this idea that you're separate and different. And so silos form by default. So I think the trouble is, first things is, it's when you think about breaking that down, especially at a certain size, it actually is arguably impractical that you get a situation where there's actually no teams and no breakups of people, no collectives within or subsets of people, or actually think about it more broadly. Same thing applies to data sets, technologies, systems. The same concept of silos actually applies to all of these separate things. In some ways, they all are impacted by the same things, are impacted by the same difficulty in transferring information or interacting between themselves. And so that's the first thing. It's difficult to do. But the other thing is, it's in some ways, you think about it, silos can be quite beneficial. I know a lot of people talk about silos because of these downsides, which are the fact that, of course, it increases the distance between people and teams, increases the frictions. But there's some really positive things about silos as well. Like we just already alluded to in some ways, it helps us organize ourselves into manageable units, whether that's in terms of technology, in terms of data, in terms of data set systems, repositories, databases, whatever it is, the silos actually do help us organize. But the other thing as well is that in doing that organization, focused in the right way, silos can actually be very positive for helping us specialize and actually gain, from that cluster, if you like, clustering of people, a clustering of systems, a clustering of data, such that the most relevant things come together, and actually, the rest of it, if you like, noise, is blocked out. It actually creates efficiencies. It makes you more effective in some ways. So I suppose the big thing is, the real question for most people, and most people think about, is how can I get the best of both worlds? How can I get really organized, really specialized, gain all the efficiencies, all the effectiveness of actually creating these buckets of things without losing the things that inherently come in with a package, right? How can I do that and still maintain good interaction, reduce the speed, reduce the distance between various individual parts and individual people. And then that's a real challenge. Yeah.
That's $1 million question right there. And I think if we had a really simple answer to that, we might not be even sitting here having this conversation. I think from the technology aspect, just what you talked about, limiting that friction between interaction, sharing of information, but still being able to tap into shared goals and shared drive within those silos is that, that balancing act that's really hard. And I think one of the things that I'd like to explore kind of through this next question is, how do I understand it from the technology side, what sharing information and how we can attain those goals. But from your perspective, how do humans play into that idea of a frictionless interaction, and what do we need to think of outside of just the right technology tools to maybe help find that balance within an organization?
$1 million question, isn't it? No, but listen, it's such an important question. I think it's a question actually, and it's something I've been thinking quite a lot about recently. In fact, I've been doing some writing, which does touch on this specifically, actually. So yeah, watch this space. There might be a book out, but I think that the real, I think that it's an area I've been really interested in thinking about for a while, and I've had so much experience of it not working very particularly well, but I've also had really good glimpses of things that actually do work. And I think that some of it is really, and you talk about the systems side and the data side, but I actually see that there's a huge amount of overlap. No, not quite the same. You don't necessarily do resolve the issues with people as you do with data, but there's a huge overlap actually. And I found that the number of the things that we do, that we need to do, is actually, and this must sound a bit strange, is actually to undo some of the things we've already done, as opposed to do more, right? And it's almost this idea of reversing some of the things that we've already done, things that we've created almost, that put those barriers in place. The barriers that will be, and let's get this get this straight. It's impossible to remove all of the frictions, because insofar as I mentioned the idea of friction, location silos as an example, you might have teams in multiple locations. So by default, you're not in the same room. You're going to have some friction in your interaction. But the question is, what are those things that we put in place in addition to the things we can't help? And I think those are the kinds of things that we need to really seriously think about. Is it things like, you actually touched on some of those very interesting things just now, Emma. You might want to share some of your thoughts as well. Things like, we have team goals and team objectives and things like that. But do we have objectives that cut across a number of these teams for a start? Is there a way that we can actually use those things that are shared as a way to actually create those connections? Or is it things like the way we, in fact, motivate or incentivize action? There's certain things that we do, and I remember this very interesting story, actually. We were trying to create a situation where teams within the organization I used to work for actually interacted a lot better together and increased the quality of code that was being generated within a data team. And so we thought, okay, so what do we need to do to enhance that? And people said to me, you know what, we've got these KPIs, and so we can just track what people are doing and all these kinds of things. And I thought, okay, let's review these KPIs then. But one of them that really does stick out in my mind, actually, when I think about this, is we were thinking about, okay, if we're going to improve code quality, we should check how much testing people are doing. How much are you testing the code? And how many bugs are you creating, are you generating from this test? And I thought, okay, but if we do that, if we check we're saying to engineers, okay, we're going to check, one of the KPIs is number of bugs. What does that incentivize? Does that really make an engineer think, I really need to open up about my bugs? I really need to be, this competition for the highest number of bugs, I need to be posting as many as I get, Or is that something that's going to actually, hamper a person's sort of intention to actually interact and actually collaborate with others and actually open up as to what's actually going on? So we thought about it, and in the end, we stepped back from that KPI, took it out, and decided that what we really wanted to be checking is interaction. So rather than look at how many bugs are generating, let's look at how much you're interacting with other engineers to buddy tests, to review and things like that, because those things ultimately would increase or reduce the chance of errors not being found out. And guess what? It generated the output, the outcome we're looking for, without creating the anxiety and things that engineers were concerned about. So in that situation, it was actually taking back things, reversing things that we had already done, that we're actually doing the opposite of what we wanted. And there's a whole raft of these kinds of things that happen in organizations.
It's really interesting that you mentioned that, because as soon as you started talking about looking at how you're incentivizing things with data and what KPIs you're tracking, it reminded me of a conversation that I had a couple of months ago with another guest, Dave DeVarney, and he was talking about specifically in his data practice at Baker Tilly that one of the things that they do is look at culture and how people are incentivizing their teams towards the appropriate goals using data, and that is something that they're spending a lot of time with organizations on today, because they're trying to dive into what incentivizes people, how do we incentivize them towards the right behavior, and how do we take that human element and combine it with the data or the technology to kind of drive towards this idea of frictionless interactions. So it's really great to hear like a concrete example of that in practice, because it jogged my memory of that conversation as well, and that this is something that organizations are grappling with and interacting with on a daily basis. And I've really enjoyed this conversation kind of focus on the frictionless experience inside the organization, because I think a lot of times when we talk about this idea with digital transformation, we think about a frictionless buying experience and what it's like from the customer perspective. And I think that is only part of the equation when we look at digital transformation. To me, there's two big buckets. There's your customer experience and there's your employee experience. And digital transformation is meant to enhance both of them and make both of them better. And so I've really enjoyed kind of taking a different lens on the frictionless idea. And I appreciate you spending the time talking through these questions with us today. And I would encourage anybody, he made a little drop of it, but he's working on a book. So go over and connect with him on LinkedIn. Take the time to keep following and catch that book when it is ready for prime time here in the future. But thank you again for joining me, and everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks for having me.
If you're looking for expert tips on how to get started with your transformation or looking to hone in on your approach, make sure that you subscribe to our channel to catch our weekly Digital Transformation Talk series, where we interview experts from around the world on how to make it happen.